This is joint work with Carlos, Anant, and Jorge, and together we started this research agenda really trying to understand why youth in Colombia actually get involved with criminal enterprises like gangs and cartels and militias. And the way we kind of approach this problem is trying to understand how joining these criminal enterprises might actually be kind of an occupational choice, kind of like a career decision in different nodes of your life. But to kind of really study this kind of theory, it's quite challenging because you need some really good individual level variation, essentially exogenous variation in the incentives to participate in these criminal enterprises, right? And you need some really good individual level administrative records, like the type you see from, looks like Harris County, Texas, and Northern Europe has some really good examples of this really good administrative records. So what we've been doing over the last half decade is linking individuals using their social security numbers across different administrative databases in the very high crime setting of Medellin, Colombia, which, as many of you know, is one of the most kind of violent cities in the world. It has a tragic history of cartels and militias and paramilitary groups. Even once homicide rates had fallen, it was still the 10th most violent city in the world, right? So the paper that I want to talk to you about today is really setting a somewhat specific policy where essentially there's a policy that increased benefits for individuals as long as they were not in the formal sector. So they targeted this policy to low-income individuals as long as they were, as long as they dropped out of the formal sector. Now, this kind of policy essentially led to a decrease in formal sector employment. Individuals dropped out of the formal sector to kind of get these benefits. I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what these benefits are, to get these benefits. And where we come in is saying that, well, if these youth don't join the formal sector, are they then more likely to start joining criminal enterprises and get involved with crime? So the specific question we're trying to answer is how these disincentives for formal sector employment actually induce these criminal careers. And we're going to try and distinguish the types of crimes that these individuals end up getting involved with, especially trying to distinguish between occupational-based crimes, like the types you see with criminal enterprises, or crimes of impulse and passion, like domestic violence and rape. What we essentially find in this paper is that as a result of this kind of disincentive for being in the formal sector employment fell, and there was an increase in arrests for these enterprise-related crimes, but there was not really a change in these crimes of impulse or passion. So what is the policy that I'm talking about? So most Colombians are essentially covered by two benefit regimes. If you're formally employed or if you're high income, you essentially pay a substantial fraction of your wages into what we call the contributive regime. Which then is used to cross-subsidize the low-income non-formal workers and the low-income non-formal households who benefit from the free subsidized regime, right? But to get the free subsidized regime, you have to not be formally employed. So what this does is it kind of creates this disincentive. It discourages formal sector employment. The government themselves recognize that it actually discourages formal sector employment. And there's actually a lot of academic literature showing how this informality clause lowered formal sector employment. So how is this policy targeted? And that's where kind of our research design becomes quite important. Everyone in Colombia gets what we call a poverty score or CISBEN score. If your poverty score is above a cutoff, you actually become eligible for what we call the subsidized regime. Right? So think of it as, me and my neighbor are almost identical in many respects. It's just that maybe my neighbor has an extra radio at home, which means that I have a slightly higher poverty score than my neighbor. I am now eligible for the subsidized regime as long as I drop out of the formal sector, right? So what you see at this poverty score cutoff is this jump in enrollment in the subsidized regime. And so for our research design, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to compare households on this side of the cutoff to this side of the cutoff, because they're almost identical households, right? Me and my neighbor are very similar. It's just that, you know, on one side of the cutoff, you're eligible for these free benefits as long as you drop out of the formal sector. So I'm going to zoom in around this cutoff and really try and understand what happens to individuals that might drop out of the formal sector to individuals that are not incentivized to drop out of the formal sector. Well, what you first see is, you know, zooming in around that cutoff is that formal sector employment fell. So individuals with a slightly higher poverty score dropped out of the formal sector with the hope of, you know, benefiting from the free benefits regime. But this has been shown by other researchers. Where we come in is we try to understand, if youth drop out of the formal sector, do they get involved with criminal enterprises? Now, crime in Medellin has a very distinct flavor where criminal enterprises are really quite prevalent. There's hundreds of street gangs in different neighborhoods, which essentially function like these kind of profit-seeking organizations. Gang leaders are actually quite well off. And if you really read interviews of gang members, they really talk about it kind of like as a career choice. They join these gangs for a profitable career. Gangs are actually recruiting individuals, offering them kind of these job options, saying, are you going to work with us? Are you going to do a different type of job, right? But if these individuals are getting involved in this kind of criminal enterprises, what we should see is that there should be a change at that cutoff. There should be a change in enterprise-based criminal activity rather than any kind of change in, say, domestic violence or any other kinds of crimes of impulse or passion, right? So to do that, to understand, you know, to make this distinction, we need to go to our data and classify the crimes as those that are likely to be associated with criminal enterprises and other types of crimes, right? The way we do that is that in our data, the police actually flag, if they suspect the person arrested to be a part of a gang, they actually flag which gang they think they're a part of. So what we can do in our data is actually look at what crimes gang members are more likely to be involved in. So for instance, we can then say that a crime like homicide is more likely to be associated with criminal enterprises, whereas a crime like rape or sexual assault, according to our data, doesn't seem to be associated with criminal enterprises, right? So we can make this distinction and then study outcomes for these different types of crimes. So when you look at, say, enterprise-based violent crime, and, you know, again, zooming in on that cutoff, what you see is that, you know, remember, individuals on this side of the cutoff dropped out of the formal sector, they are more likely to get involved in enterprise-related violent crimes, like homicides, for instance. When you look at property crime, again, it looks quite similar, where, you know, individuals that drop out of the formal sector are actually more likely to be involved in enterprise-related property crime. With drug crimes, actually, there's not much of a statistical difference at the cutoff. So there's not much of a change around the cutoff. And, you know, in the interest of time, I'm not showing you the results for the non-enterprise related crimes, but there's actually no detectable change at the cutoff in crimes of impulse or passion. The other kind of thing we try and understand is that, are these effects different by the type of neighborhood you live in? Right, the city is actually quite a segregated city, where a lot of the gang activity is, you know, in the northeast and the west and the east and the kind of the extremities, whereas a lot of the formal sector employment happens around downtown. So is it that if I live in a gang neighborhood, is it more easy for me to kind of switch out of the formal sector and get involved in these criminal enterprises? And the answer is, we do find that at least for certain types of crime, these effects that we pick up are actually a lot stronger in gang neighborhoods than they are in non-gang neighborhoods, right? So what are we doing in this paper? We're really trying to estimate this kind of occupational choice, this career decision at the individual level, right? And, you know, from a crime policy point of view, there's this idea that, more policing or deterrence might have a limited amount of efficacy in a context like this, if, for instance, the youth are really being disincentivized away from formal sexual work, right? So at vulnerable ages, when these youth are 16 or 18 years old, if they're not being encouraged to join the formal sector labor market, they make a decision to get involved in these criminal enterprises, and that can really change the trajectory of their lives, but they're kind of stuck in these criminal careers, right? So trying to incentivize these youth to get involved in the formal sector can be quite an effective strategy in trying to keep them away from these criminal enterprises. More specifically, for a policy like this, this kind of policy that we are studying is actually quite common in other parts of Latin America and even other low and middle income countries, where they have these kind of informality clauses, where they say that you'll only get these benefits if you're not in the formal sector. But these kind of informality clauses can lead to these kind of perverse outcomes. You could still target these benefits to low-income households without requiring them to drop out of the formal sector. If you take away this informality clause, you can have this added benefit of really kind of discouraging youth to get involved in these criminal enterprises. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.